In early 1990, Patricia Candace Walsh, or Candy, age 24, and Douglas Scott Zyskowski, 28, a newly married couple from the Seattle, Washington area, disappeared while traveling across the southern United States. Both were active members of the Everyday Church, an evangelical congregation, and were journeying toward Georgia with the intention of participating in missionary work. As part of their faith practice, the couple traveled by hitchhiking, a documented method they had used during their travels. Their last known contact occurred from El Paso, Texas, where they told their minister that they planned to continue west towards Arizona. After that call, they were never heard from again. Months later, the couple was discovered in two different states, hundreds of miles apart. Zyskowski's body was found on Interstate 10 in Sutton County, Texas, while Walsh's remains were later located in a remote area of Millard County, Utah. At the time of the discovery, investigators had no indication that the cases were connected, and the deaths were initially treated as separate, unrelated homicides. There are moments in life when faith feels abstract, something spoken about in quiet rooms, written in books, or debated in theory. And then there are moments when faith becomes physical, tangible, something you step into with both feet, trusting that the road ahead will hold you up. In the late 1980s, America was still a place where the open road carried a certain bit of promise. Long stretches of asphalt stitched together towns, states, and lives that might never otherwise cross paths. Hitchhiking wasn't unheard of. It wasn't common everywhere, but it wasn't unthinkable either, especially for those who believed that the journey itself could be part of a greater calling. For Candy Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski, faith wasn't something they practiced from a distance. It shaped how they lived, how they traveled, and how they understood the world around them. They were young, newly married, and deeply committed to their evangelical beliefs. To them, movement wasn't aimless, it was purposeful. Every mile mattered, every conversation mattered. Every stranger was an opportunity to share something that they believed was bigger than themselves. In late 1989, they left Seattle, Washington, and began traveling east. Their destination was Georgia, where they planned to attend a religious convention. What came after that was less fixed, but the intention was clear. Continue traveling, continue ministering, continue trusting that their needs would be met along the way. They traveled light, and they traveled together, and they traveled by hitchhiking, relying on rides from strangers, guided by the belief that God would provide protection and passage. For a time, the journey unfolded as planned. They stayed with people they met along the way, they made phone calls home, they checked in with their church. Their movement across the country could be traced not by tickets or receipts, but by human connections, by conversations, couches, and short stays that left little paper behind. Then, in early 1990, that trail ended. Their final known contact came from El Paso, Texas, in a phone call to their minister. Candy and Douglas talked about where they were and where they hoped to go next, west towards Arizona. It was an ordinary call, the kind that doesn't raise alarms in the moment. No distress, no warning, just plans, shared briefly before moving on. And after that, there was silence. Days passed, and then weeks. Eventually, concern set in, but concern doesn't always come with answers, especially when the road stretches across multiple states and multiple jurisdictions. Months later, the truth emerged in fragments. Douglas was found in Texas, near Interstate 10 in Sutton County. Far from there, Candy was discovered in Utah, in a remote area of Millard County. 2 locations, 2 crime scenes, hundreds of miles apart. At the time, there was nothing obvious tying these cases together. Different states, different circumstances. One victim identified, no shared suspect. To investigators, these were separate tragedies, unrelated acts of violence in a vast country where disappearances sometimes vanish into geography itself. What no one knew then was that these two deaths were part of the same story, a story that would come into focus later through evidence, through investigation, and through a chance encounter on a desert highway that would finally pull the truth into the light. But here, at the beginning, there was only faith and an open road that never led them home. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
It's good. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Good. Getting some sleep now?
Well, I fell asleep about 3:30, I would say.
Holy
this morning.
crap.
So I got a little bit of sleep.
A little bit?
Yeah. But it was better than the night before when I was up editing at 1:30 and just
For like
all
weeks straight, just
that particular
no rest for the wicked.
It was all night long, but it wasn't necessarily because I had to get something edited. It was just I couldn't sleep. I got tired of laying there, so I figured, what the hell, I might as well get something done. So I got up and started working. So, but are you very familiar with this case?
Only from little snippets that you've told me. Some of this is starting to sound familiar, and I'm feeling like it's your favorite guy.
It's one of the asshats.
Okay.
Yeah, not the particular asshat that you're thinking of, but definitely an asshat.
Okay.
So you ready to jump into it?
Yep.
All right, listeners. Well, welcome back. This is Dark Dialogue, Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the series where we dig into the cases buried beneath distance, time, and silence across the American West.
The ones that didn't make national headlines, the ones that fractured families, and the ones that still sit unanswered in case files decades later.
Before we get into tonight's case, I want to bring Angela in here. This story...
I'm already in here, man.
This story starts quietly, no crime scene, no obvious moment where everything goes wrong, and those are often the hardest ones to sit with. So, Angela, how are you feeling heading into this one?
Honestly, uneasy. There's something about cases where people disappear while doing something they genuinely believed in. There's no chaos at the beginning. There's no warning signs, just trust that I don't have. So that's also why I'm uneasy.
Yeah, me either.
And that makes what follows this feel even heavier.
Yeah, it does. And that's exactly where this one lives. So tonight's episode is titled Faith on the Open Road, the disappearance of Patricia Walsh and Douglas Scott Zyskowski. This is the first part of a 2-episode case, and we want to be very clear about what this episode is and what it isn't. So this episode is not about the arrest, it's not about the suspect, and it's not about what investigators would eventually discover years later. In the beginning, when Candy and Douglas were simply a married couple traveling across the country, guided by faith, trusting the road, and believing that their journey had purpose.
And when they disappeared, there was no immediate reason to think the worst had happened.
Right. Their last known contact, like I said, came from El Paso, Texas. There was silence. And when the bodies were later discovered in 2 different states, hundreds of miles apart, investigators had no reason to believe that they were connected. Like I said, different jurisdictions, different circumstances, one victim identified, no shared motive. At the time, these were treated as separate tragedies.
Which I guess matters here because it explains why answers didn't come quickly.
Exactly. So tonight, we're going to walk through what was known then, the timeline, the geography, and the limits that investigators were working within before any larger picture existed. So if you're listening on YouTube, make sure you like the episode, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you don't miss future cases. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else, follow the show, leave a rating or a review, and share this episode. That engagement helps keep cases like this in the public eye right where they belong, and it only takes a second of your time. So,
and I keep saying it's free.
And it's free. Yeah, all it takes is just a second. So just take a second right now,
man,
and click.
All the cool kids are doing it.
That is exactly right. So now let's get back to the beginning, before the connection and before the reckoning. The highway stretches west, long and unbroken. White lines flick past in steady rhythm, disappearing beneath the headlights as fast as they appear. Out here, the road feels endless, just asphalt, wind, and the hum of engines moving through the dark. A truck passes, its tires hissing against the pavement, the rush of air briefly filling the space before fading again into the open night. Somewhere, an AM radio crackles, voices half-formed, music bleeding through static, never quite settling on a single station. There's a strange comfort in motion like this, the sense that as long as you keep moving, the world will carry you forward. The land on either side of the highway is mostly invisible now. Fields, scrub, fences, whatever's out there exists beyond the reach of the headlights. What matters is the road itself, pulling west, mile after mile. For travelers, the highway can feel like promise, a way through, a path toward something waiting just beyond the next rise. But the road doesn't know who's on it. It doesn't ask where you're coming from or where you're going. It just keeps moving, quiet, indifferent, stretching forward into the dark. And sometimes, without warning, a ride west becomes the last place a journey is ever known to continue. Angela, you got some location information to tell us about for tonight's case?
Looks like it.
Awesome. Well, have at it. The floor is yours.
The floor is mine. That's a lot. Anyway.
Yeah.
The geography in this case matters more than it might seem at first glance. Candy Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski, am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Didn't disappear in one place, and they weren't found in one place either. Their journey, and ultimately the investigation, stretched across vastly different landscapes, law enforcement systems, and jurisdictional realities. And those differences are a large part of why their story remained fragmented for so long. To understand that, we need to start where their journey began. Seattle, Washington is the point of origin. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Seattle was a dense, fast-moving coastal city, the economic and cultural hub of the Pacific Northwest. By 1990, the greater metropolitan area was approaching 2 million people. Way too big for me.
Yeah.
Neighborhoods were tightly packed, traffic was constant, and people moved in and out of the city every day for work, travel, and school. Seattle was also operating in what criminologists now recognize as a national high crime area. Violent crime rates were elevated compared to later decades, and law enforcement agencies were managing a heavy volume of cases. In that environment, adults traveling voluntarily, especially those without vehicles or fixed itineraries, did not immediately stand out. For Candy and Douglas, Seattle wasn't a place of danger. It was home. It was where they were part of a church community, where they were known, and where their decision to travel was understood within a religious context. Leaving the city didn't trigger alarms because there was no reason for it to. People left Seattle every day.
So from the start, there's nothing geographically unusual about them leaving.
Exactly. No red flags, no abrupt break. They weren't fleeing something or vanishing from a static life. They were moving. And movement, especially in a city like Seattle, doesn't draw attention unless something goes wrong immediately. But once they left the Pacific Northwest, the geography and the risks changed dramatically. After traveling east to Georgia and then back west, Candy and Douglas entered one of the most isolating transportation corridors in the United States, Interstate 10. Particularly the stretches around El Paso, Texas. On a map, I-10 looks like a lifeline, a major transcontinental freeway connecting California to the southeast. But on the ground, especially west of El Paso, it becomes something very different. Long, straight segments cut through desert and ranch land. Services thin out. Towns are small and far apart. At night, traffic can feel sporadic rather than constant. This is important because highways like I-10 create a paradox. They are heavily used, but not heavily observed. Vehicles move quickly through enormous stretches of land, policed by small agencies responsible for hundreds or even thousands of square miles. In 1990, Texas was experiencing high overall crime numbers statewide. But that statistic masks a sharp divide. Urban centers handled the bulk of violent crime. Rural counties along remote interstate corridors often saw very little serious violence, at least on paper, and were staffed accordingly.
So even though it's a major highway, the surroundings are effectively rural?
Yes.
Okay.
And this matters because rural sheriff's offices along I-10 were not structured to detect patterns across counties, let alone across states. A body found along the highway might be treated as a local tragedy, not part of something larger. And that's exactly what happened here. In Sutton County, Texas, where Douglas was found, Sutton County sits on Edwards Plateau, limestone hills, scrub brush, open ranch lands. In 1990, the county's population hovered around 4,000 people spread across more than 1,400 square miles. That's extremely low density, miles of land for every resident. Interstate 10 cuts directly through the county, but outside of Sonora, the small county seat, there's very little development. Long stretches of road pass through land where no one lives close enough to hear or see anything happening along the shoulder. When Douglas's body was discovered near I-10 in Sutton County, it entered an investigative environment shaped by isolation. The local sheriff's office was small. Resources were limited. Violent crime was rare enough that a homicide was not routine occurrence. There was no immediate reason for investigators there to think about Washington State, or Georgia, or Utah, or a second victim who had not yet been found. From their perspective, this was a single body in a vast rural county, a serious crime, yes, but one that appeared geographically contained.
At this point, Candy hasn't been found yet.
Correct. There's no second scene, no second county, no reason to suspect this was part of a pair. Douglas's death stood alone in the Texas records. Months later, hundreds of miles away, Candy Walsh's remains were discovered in Millard County, Utah. Millard County is another study in scale and isolation. In 1990, the county had roughly 11 to 12,000 residents spread across high desert terrain west of Utah's main population corridor. Communities like Fillmore and Delta are separated by long stretches of open land, volcanic fields, low ridges, juniper flats, and dry basins that stretch towards the Black Rock Desert. That is for dang sure those are dry basins.
Yes, they are.
Unlike Sutton County, Millard County is not anchored by a major east-west interstate. Interstate 15 runs north-south through the eastern part of the county, but large areas remain far removed from daily traffic and routine observation. When Candy's remains were found, they were not immediately identified. She entered the system as an unidentified homicide victim, a Jane Doe, we've heard all too often.
Yep.
That classification alone created a barrier. Without a name, there was nothing to link her to a missing persons report in another state.
So even if someone suspected a connection, there was nothing concrete to attach it to.
Exactly. No identity, no shared jurisdiction, no shared timeline. And remember, this is 1990. There was no centralized national database doing cross-state matching the way we expect today. Everything depends on manual reporting and human recognition. The distance between Sutton County, Texas, and Millard County, Utah is measured in hundreds of miles, crossing multiple states, landscape, and law enforcement systems. Texas and Utah had separate reporting standards. Pushed the wrong button. Texas and Utah had separate reporting standards, separate investigative cultures, and separate priorities. Seattle, Sutton County, and Millard County each represented entirely different policing realities. A large urban police department in a high-crime coastal city, a small rural sheriff's office along a remote interstate corridor, a sparsely populated mountain desert county overseeing vast open land. There was no automatic mechanism to connect those dots. Investigators in Texas were not scanning Utah Jane Doe cases. Investigators in Utah had no identified missing person to match Candy's remains to. And law enforcement in Washington had no body, no crime scene, and no evidence of where the couple had gone beyond their last phone call. Add terrain to that equation, deserts that erase tracks, open ranch land where activity goes unseen, and remote disposal locations, and the picture becomes clear. This wasn't an investigative failure driven by indifference. It was a structural limitation driven by geography.
So the land itself becomes part of the reason that the case stays fractured.
Yes. Distance doesn't just separate places, it separates information. And in cases like this, geography delays truth as much as time does. The couple's journey crossed environments that don't speak to each other easily. And until a single piece of evidence forced those conversations to happen, Candy Walsh and Douglas Zyskowski, I'll get it one of these days, existed as two separate names in two separate states. Their shared story hidden by the sheer scale of the American West.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela.
My goodness, that was difficult.
So let's get this out of the way right now. So it's a little bit confusing about her name. It's Patricia, it's Candy, It's Walsh, it's Zyskowski. So I'm going to be referring to her probably as both Patricia and Candy as we go through this.
Okay.
And we're just going to say Zyskowski for both of them. They were married, and I don't know. I am not entirely sure. I have my suspicions, but I am not entirely sure if she was like a hyphen, which I don't believe she was. I think that they were just so newly married that the whole name change and everything hadn't occurred yet. But because of their religious beliefs and everything, I'm going on the assumption that that was just a formality. I think that she was, by all intents and purposes, Patricia or Candy Zyskowski. So that's how we'll be referring to her.
Didn't you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this was kind of like a honeymoon type situation?
Yeah.
So it would be that soon.
It was soon.
That you're not doing all that paperwork immediately.
Right. Yeah, it all kind of takes a little bit of time. So, but just so everybody's clear, you might hear Patricia, you might hear Candy, but Zyskowski is going to be the last name.
Okay.
Otherwise, we just have so many names floating around, we can't keep track of them all.
This is true. That I was stumbling over them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So before Candy became part of a criminal investigation, before her name appeared in court records or newspaper articles, she was simply a young woman living in the Seattle area and building a life shaped by faith, community, and a sense of purpose that guided her decisions. Candy Zyskowski was born on December the 18th, 1966. So by the end of 1989, she was 23 years old, approaching her 24th birthday. She lived in King County, Washington, which is part of the greater Seattle metropolitan area, and records from both family and then later memorial documentation identify her under her married name, like I said, which it's all identified as Patricia Candace Walsh Zyskowski. So I don't know, like I say, if she was technically a hyphen or not. My suspicion is it all happened so fast that she never really had a chance to be Candy Zyskowski.
It's generally not the first thing you do.
Right. And I don't mean like legally. I mean as a person. Not even on paper. As a person.
Oh, yeah.
Her parents probably still considered her Walsh.
Yeah.
Her friends still considered her Walsh. And so I believe that, and I'm just guessing, but I think that that's the root here as to what's going on. So what can be established with certainty is not a detailed portrait of her personality, but the framework of her life at the time. So Candy was deeply involved in an evangelical Christian community, and she structured her daily life around that belief system. Her identity, as has been documented by family members and church contacts, was closely tied to religious commitment rather than career, education, or long-term secular planning. So at some point prior to late 1989, she married Douglas Scott Zyskowski. So the contemporary descriptions and the later case summaries consistently refer to them as newlyweds during their travels. So it was a recent marriage. The exact date of their wedding, I couldn't find, but by November of 89, they were traveling together as husband and wife. So Candy entered that marriage with the religious context that was already firmly established. Douglas had previously left a former partner to join the evangelical group that he met, where he met Candy, and that they would later represent together. So that detail is important, not as commentary on either one of them, but because it places their marriage squarely inside of an existing religious worldview rather than marking it as like the beginning of it.
Okay.
So the religion itself, a community and the community surrounding it, was not peripheral to Candy's life. Both she and Douglas were members of the Everyday Church. And they're an evangelical congregation that's based in Seattle, and it's now defunct. I couldn't find anything saying that it's still around.
Okay.
So,
do we know why? Was there?
There was nothing, and I didn't really dig into it because it's not that important. But I mean, these kind of non-denominational churches kind of spring up and go away a lot.
Yeah.
So
just makes me wonder, though, if it's going to be somebody we'll end up covering later because, it's a Waco situation? Or am I just reading too far into it?
Oh, yeah, you're reading way too far into it. This is just...
It's the true crime mind.
Yeah. No, this isn't like a cult-like situation. This is very much a traditional...
It just dissolved.
Yeah, it just dissolved. It is very much a traditional Christian evangelical church.
Okay.
So, and so everything that I could find specifically says that they were evangelists or missionaries that were affiliated with that church. So it wasn't a casual association. Church sources and family statements consistently describe their faith as the organizing principle that was behind all of their choices. So in November of 89, Candy and Douglas departed the Seattle area and began traveling east. Their initial destination was a religious convention that was happening in Georgia, and the purpose of the trip was framed both internally and to others as missionary work. They intended to share their religious message with people that they encountered along the way, and travel itself was viewed as part of that calling. And the evangelical belief, and there's many, many evangelical churches, but the belief is exactly that, evangelizing. And so evangelical churches, their whole kind of goal is to share the message with other people. And so you get a lot of the missionaries this isn't necessarily the vein of knocking on your door. This is the vein of just sharing their message with everybody that they come across. Evangelicals don't necessarily like come to your door and say, in their little suits and all that.
Yeah.
That's really not what this is. This is more of in everyday life. Their job every day, 24 hours a day, is to share the message of Christ to everybody that they come across.
Right.
So their method of travel was hitchhiking, and that was not incidental. It was not adopted out of convenience or necessity alone. According to Candy's brother and other family contacts, she described hitchhiking as, quote, act of faith in God and a religious calling.
Scary.
Yeah. So the couple believed that God had instructed them to travel in this way and that their needs, food, shelter, transportation, would be provided through faith. And I just got to say, I don't mean to offend anybody, but I am definitely not cut from that vein. That whole,
I'm not either.
I can do anything and God will protect me vein. Like that is, and I'm not saying anything about their religious beliefs, and I'm not, if that's
to each their own.
To each their own.
It is not for us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but that belief shaped their choices in very practical ways. It's reported that they traveled without identification.
What?
which is a decision that aligns with their stated belief that they were to rely entirely on divine provision rather than documentation or planning.
I can't.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time. I really have a hard time with this line of thinking. It's not my cup of tea.
No.
So
I'm so scared for people that still do this.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, man.
So after attending the religious event in Georgia, they stayed with a woman that they met through their church connections, and that stay is one of the last clearly documented points of contact along their journey. So during that period, the couple communicated that they felt, quote, called to the West to do the Lord's work. And that phrasing appears consistently across everything that I found, and it reflects how they described their intentions at the time. Like it's admirable. It's admirable, I gotta say. They were so devoted to their beliefs, they were so devoted to their religion, and it was their entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't have that.
I don't want to distract from it, but it's terrifying.
It's freaking terrifying. Yes.
I mean,
maybe it's I don't have that faith that they have.
I mean, yeah.
Or I don't have the
I gotta tell you, it's not the same faith, but my mom has that much faith, and she still wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's difficult because I don't want to offend any.
No, I get it. I get it. I'm not trying to either.
But the fact of the matter is there is a clear delineating line between your standard Christians who believe, that they believe in God, they believe in Christ, they believe in all of that. They're very faithful. They go to church on Sundays. They do all those things, but they're not going to walk into a biker bar in downtown LA because they might get raped and murdered.
Yeah.
They're realistic about it. And I'm not saying that the Zyskowskis weren't realistic, but there is a delineating line between, I'm going to go to the hospital and I'm going to get care because I'm sick and the doctors can fix me. And on the other side, which is probably more extreme than the Zyskowskis, but it's the same vein of, I'm going to pray really hard and God's going to heal me. And I'm not making any judgments one way or another, but there is a definite...
If it works for you, it works.
There is a definite delineating line between those different types of faith. It's kind of like the God helps them that helps themselves, or God's going to take care of everything. The differences, right?
Right.
If that makes sense.
It actually brought a lot of sense to my brain. So thank you for that.
Yep. Anytime. So their movements after leaving Georgia are partially traceable through the contact that they made, but not really so much through records. They relied on rides from strangers. They stayed temporarily with people that they met, and they maintained limited but meaningful communication with their families and their church leadership. So these were not tourists that were following any kind of a fixed itinerary. Their travel was just open-ended by design. I mean, it is like the show Into the Wild.
I was like, you're looking at me like, tell me what it is, and I was blank.
It is like the show Into the Wild, where Christopher McCandless, who is the actual true person that's represented. Have you seen that show?
Mm-mm.
Wow, really? Okay, well, you're missing out because it's freaking awesome. Eddie Vedder does a kick-ass
It's not by choice.
Soundtrack to it. It's a really good show.
Into the Wild?
Into the Wild.
Remind me.
Really good book, great movie. It's based on Christopher McCandless's story. He just walked away from his life. His parents were very wealthy and, wanted him to finish college. And I think he did finish college.
And that's the one where people are just randomly doing it to see if they can do it too. Is that or is that a whole another story that I'm...
It's a movement that really started even before that with a young man, I can't remember his name, but he just walked away from it all and then kind of ended the same way, I think. But Christopher McCandless walked away from it all. He ended up in Alaska. He ate some poisonous plants and he died in defunct school bus out in the middle of the wilderness up there. That's kind of that story.
Okay.
But the movie itself follows his, and he hitchhiked, he walked, and there's a woman in the movie that describes it as like rubber tramps and leather tramps, and rubber tramps drive vehicles, leather tramps walk, but they just freely travel wherever they want to go. And back then and even now, there's a whole community of people that live like this.
Yeah.
And you see it actually in your line of work, because some of these people actually show up at places like motels and campgrounds and stuff like that and work for a season. Yep. And then they'll go, they work in the summertime, they might be up north, and then in the winter, they're at a different motel or campground or something in the south.
Yeah.
They just it's that whole tramp kind of lifestyle. And I'm not saying that these guys were of that same vein, but, they were just kind of going where the road took them, which is kind of freaking cool, and
it's
kind
exciting
of
and terrifying at the same time.
I would be a rubber tramp. I'd be in charge of where I went and how I got there. So, yeah. But Candy did remain in touch with her family during the journey. And in December, she called her brother from Georgia to explain that she and Douglas were how they were doing, what they were doing, and where they intended to go next. And so that call is documented, and it represents one of the very few points at which her voice directly enters the record. So by January, they made what would become their final known contact, and they spoke by phone with their minister and stated that they were in El Paso, Texas, and they were planning to continue west towards Arizona. There was no report of any kind of distress or anything like that. There's no indication that they felt unsafe or that they anticipated any kind of danger. It was described as just a normal kind of a conversation that was consistent with all their other conversations. Nothing stood out. After that call, Candy was never heard from again. So at that time, there was no immediate reason for alarm. Candy was an adult. She was traveling voluntarily. Her movements were consistent with what she had described to her family and her church members. There was no fixed date of return, so no expectation of any kind of regular check-ins or anything like that beyond just occasional phone calls. And this is 1990, so like we say in so many of these stories, way before cell phones or anything like that. So when you had
phones,
when you had somebody that was traveling in this way as a parent or as a family member, it drove you crazy, and you literally just had to sit and wait
and hope and pray.
They called, and if they didn't call, there was nothing you could. I mean,
because I'm assuming their family was the same, so they were probably praying as well.
I believe so. Yeah, I'm sure that they were Christian. Whether they were in this same congregation and stuff, I don't know.
Right. Okay.
So, but like I say, there was no reason for alarm. And it was only later, when months had passed without contact, that the silence takes a different weight. So when Candy's remains were eventually discovered in Millard County, Utah, like you said, she was unidentified. She entered the system as a Jane Doe, separated not only from her name, but from the story of how she came to be there. And without identification, there was nothing that linked her to any kind of a missing persons report in Washington or in Texas. Her religious background, her marriage, her journey, all of that remained unknown to the investigators at the time. So for years, Candy existed in records only as an unidentified victim. Her identity would not be restored until much, much later, after evidence recovered in an unrelated investigation finally allowed authorities to connect her remains to her name. So what can be said without any speculation is this: Patricia Candace Zyskowski was a young woman whose life choices were guided by faith as she understood it. Her decision to travel, her marriage, and her missionary intent were documented by family and church sources and were consistent with the belief system that she had adopted. She did not disappear from a static life. She vanished in motion. Her story did not end because she abandoned her beliefs or her marriage or her family. It ended because something happened on that journey. something that removed her from it entirely. And for a long time, even her name was missing. So Douglas Scott Zyskowski was born on November 19th, 1963. And like Candy, he lived in Seattle at the time of his disappearance. And before his full commitment to religious work, Douglas was involved in a very different community. In the mid-1980s, he was active in the freestyle skateboarding scene, which was a subculture that was still emerging into broader recognition at the time. I mean, this is the day of like Tony Hawk.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so in 86, he placed third.
An interesting change. Anyway, sorry.
I mean, it happens a lot.
I know.
But in 86, he placed third in an amateur freestyle skating contest at Expo 86 in Vancouver, Canada. And that same year, he appeared in the skate film Radical Moves. And he actually has a credit in there as Doug Zyskowski. So he was in there alongside other contest skaters that were also featured in the film. And those appearances place him within a very specific moment in skateboarding history, and one that included early footage of figures such as Rodney Mullen and a young Tony Hawk, like I said. So these details establish a verifiable record of his life before his religious involvement became central to it. They don't define his personality or his motivations, but they demonstrate that his path into evangelical work represented a shift rather than a continuation of a single lifelong trajectory. So Douglas had a son from a previous relationship. His former partner has stated publicly that they separated in 1986 prior to the baby's birth. After Douglas joined what she described as a, quote, religious Christian cult, end quote, that characterization reflects her perspective and is included only as it appears in the documented accounts that I found. And I'm not, again, making any kind of independent assessment, but she felt like it was a cult.
Right.
And I got to be honest, for somebody that doesn't, I've watched your eyes as I've talked about a lot of this shit and even heard you are we going to be having an episode on this?
Yeah.
It is it's hard for the rest of us to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to put all my faith in God and I'm going to do these.
And you just drop everything.
And I'm going to, travel the road as a hitchhiker and put myself in harm's way and trust that God's going to keep me safe. Like I said, I make no judgment, but I don't believe that. I would never do that. So I can understand why somebody would be like, wow, that's a cult. And also going from the skating community, and I have no idea about Douglas's life.
Right.
If he was like a wild man or whatever.
It's stereotypical, but it just feels night and day.
Yeah, I think it was a major shift. And so the girlfriend, whatever, I don't believe that they weren't married, but so whatever you want to call it, the girlfriend, the baby mama, whatever, she was probably of that skateboarding world, right? And this is somebody, in terms that I can understand, this is like headbanging Metallica, freaking, Slayer, whatever. And then all of a sudden you're going to church every Sunday. It is a huge shift.
So you would think cult, who's brainwashing you in that sense?
Yeah, well, not saying that they were brainwashing, but yes.
Yeah, they would think that.
On the side where your friend is leaving or your lover or whatever and doing this, you're like, you're being freaking brainwashed by these people.
Yeah.
Come back to the Metallica concert with me. So, at the time that he disappeared, Douglas's immediate family included his parents and two brothers. And after he went missing, they undertook a prolonged effort to locate him, spending approximately 2 years traveling across the U.S. in search of information. And so by late 1989, Douglas was married to Patricia, or Candy, and the two are described in all the sources as newlyweds traveling together. And their marriage operated entirely, like I said, within their religious framework. Both were associated with this everyday church, and their decision to leave Washington in 89 was framed in everything that I found as a missionary undertaking. So hitchhiking was Douglas's established and documented mode of travel during these missionary efforts. So they consistently described that he and Candy intentionally hitchhiked. This was their plan. They weren't like stuck out there. They planned on doing that. And so
does anybody know if they had a vehicle before this and they just left it behind as this act of service?
I don't know that, but I do believe that. Okay. I think that they had a normal life and
they just left it all behind.
They just walked away from it.
Service. Okay.
Yep. And so I don't know a whole lot more about Douglas's life. It's just important to note that him and Candy were not anonymous travelers. They weren't drifters without any kind of ties. They were a married couple acting within their belief system that had shaped the way that they moved through the world.
Okay.
And their disappearance didn't mark a departure from that life. It marked an interruption of it. Every journey has moments where movement slows, where the road pauses and the world seems to hold its breath. A vehicle pulls off the highway, not abruptly, not in panic, just enough to leave the flow of traffic behind. The hum of passing engines drift away, replaced by open air and silence. The ground here is uneven. Dirt, gravel, weeds bending in the wind, headlights casting narrow circle, bright at the center, fading quickly at the edges. Outside that light, there's nothing but dark. Footsteps cross the ground and then stop. A door opens, a door closes, and then there's distance. The road waits unchanged. It doesn't mark where anyone stood or how long they lingered. Tires will pass here again. Wind will smooth over the ground. The moment will disappear as if it never happened. Travel promises connection. One place to another, one person to the next. But when motion ends, what remains is separation, a space where paths diverge without ceremony. The engine starts again. The sound grows faint. The darkness settles back in. And whatever this place was meant to be, a pause, a turning point, an ending, it slips quietly into the vastness of the road behind it. So on January 21st, 1990, motorists that were traveling westbound on Interstate 10 in Sutton County, Texas, passed through a stretch of road that looked no different from any of the rest of them along that corridor. Open ranch land, long sight lines, and a little indication that anything out of ordinary had occurred there. That morning, however, authorities were called to a location along the highway roughly 30 miles outside of Arizona, in the wide rural span between San Antonio and El Paso. There, alongside the road, deputies discovered the body of an unidentified white male. At the time of the recovery, the victim had no identity. He carried no identification, and there was nothing immediately present that linked him to a missing persons report in Texas or anywhere else. The case was opened as a roadside homicide, and the man was logged in the official records as John Doe. So the initial assessments placed the victim in his mid-20s. Investigators documented evidence of both blunt force trauma and gunshot wounds, indicating that he had been beaten and then shot. Later summaries would specify that the cause of death was 3 gunshot wounds to the head, inflicted by a small caliber firearm. Those details, however, were not immediately tied to any suspect or known criminal activity in the area. The recovery itself offered few answers. Sutton County encompasses, like you said, more than 1,400 square miles, and it's very sparsely populated. Interstate 10 cuts through it with really minimal interruption. It's like the interstate across Wyoming. It's just, not a lot of big cities and shit like that to go through. So There was no nearby residences, no businesses that were in sight, and no immediate witnesses at the scene when the body was discovered. What investigators did recover were a small number of associative items that were carefully logged as potential leads rather than conclusions. Among those was a dated, time-stamped receipt from a nearby gift shop. The receipt suggested recent movement through the area, but it did not on its own identify the victim or explain how he came to be in that location. There was a women's wristwatch, which was also found and collected as evidence. And its presence definitely raised questions, particularly whether the victim had been traveling with a woman or with just what.
Well, I would wonder if it was new or old to judge that, if he was traveling with someone or if he had purchased it for someone. Was it new or
It
old?
was not new.
Okay.
So it didn't establish any clear narrative.
Okay.
So at that point, the case rested largely on physical findings and geography. So sometime after the body's discovery, investigators received a report from a truck driver who stated that he had seen something unusual along that same general stretch of Interstate 10. And according to the account that was preserved, the driver reported seeing one man assaulting another man behind a vehicle. He also noted the presence of a young woman wearing what he described as, quote, hippie-type clothing. So this account was logged as the primary eyewitness report that was connected to the case, and it provided investigators with a possible scenario, one that involved multiple individuals, but it didn't supply any names, license plates, or any identifying features that were sufficient to move the investigation forward in any kind of concrete way. So despite the lead, the victim remained unidentified. His body had been recovered in January of 1990, but no immediate match was made to any kind of missing persons report. And at the time, law enforcement databases were limited to manual entry and jurisdictional separation. We didn't have nationwide databases for really anything in 1990. So missing persons reported in one state were not always visible or easily searchable by agencies in another state. It wasn't until 1992, approximately 2 years after the body was found, that the victim was officially identified as Douglas Scott Zyskowski. And that it was later said that that delay was due to incorrect data entry into the missing person's computer system, which prevented an earlier match between his disappearance and the John Doe that was recovered in Sutton County. But even after that identification, the case remained isolated. His death was now named, but it still stood alone. There was no confirmed connection to another victim, no linked jurisdiction, no broader investigative framework that placed his homicide within any kind of a larger pattern. And that separation persisted for years. It wouldn't be until June 2003, more than a decade after he was identified, that investigators finally connected the Sutton County homicide to the remains of an unidentified woman in Millard County, Utah. Remains later confirmed to be those of Patricia Candace Zyskowski, Douglas's wife. But in January of 1990, none of that was known. What investigators in Sutton County had was a young man dead along a remote interstate highway with no identification, no local ties, and no immediate answers. His death was serious, but it appeared contained. A single homicide in a vast rural county accustomed to long stretches of road and very few witnesses. So at that moment, Douglas Scott Zyskowski was not part of a larger story. He was a John Doe on the side of Interstate 10. So on October 26, 1990, deer hunters moving through a remote area of Millard County, Utah, came upon skeletal human remains in an isolated mountainous location near the mouth of a canyon. The site sat on a juniper-covered ridge close to Interstate 15, approximately 22 miles south of Fillmore. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition. Essentially, it was just a skeleton. And, it was obviously consistent with prolonged exposure to outdoor conditions over several months. There was no immediate indicators of identity, no documents, no personal effects, no nearby items that could establish who the victim was or how she came to be there. Local authorities responded and secured the scene. From the outset, the case was treated as a homicide. It was not an accidental death. An autopsy conducted later documented that the victim had been shot multiple times in the head and neck with a .22 caliber firearm. Scene observations indicated that the body appeared to have been killed at that location rather than transported there after death. Investigators also documented that the remains had been deliberately positioned, with the victim's long braided hair arranged over one shoulder. For investigative and administrative purposes, the victim was designated Jane Doe 1. At the time, there was no identification, no missing persons report that would match the remains, and no evidence linking this homicide to any other known cases. And like you said, Millard County in 1990 was, and really it still is, sparsely populated and geographically vast. Much of the terrain surrounding the discovery site consisted of high desert, low ridges, and open land extending far beyond routine observation. So while Interstate 15 ran nearby, the area itself was remote, a place where activity could go unnoticed for long periods of time. Investigators cataloged what they had and what they did not. What they did have included the skeletal remains, which were sufficient for anthropological and dental examination, including the jaw and the teeth. They had ballistic information, which established the use of a .22 caliber firearm, and they had the scene observations regarding the position of the body, the arrangement of the braided hair. But what they did not have was equally as important. No clothing, jewelry, purse, or personal items were recovered at the scene or anywhere near it. No identification papers. No known connection to any missing person from Utah or anywhere else. And with no immediate leads, the case settled into long-term status. The remains, particularly the jaw and the dentition, were retained by the Millard County Sheriff's Office as evidence and preserved specifically to allow for future comparison if any new information ever became available. So for approximately 13 years, the victim remained unidentified. And during that period, Utah authorities treated the case as a standalone homicide. There was no known link to a missing couple from Washington, no awareness of an unidentified male that was recovered earlier along Interstate 10 in Texas, and no active information that was exchanged between Millard County, Utah and Sutton County, Texas that connected the two cases in any way. And that is in no way a slight against either one of those states or departments. It just wasn't done back then.
Yeah.
This was a problem of the era, not a problem of the investigation. Like, the shit didn't happen. It didn't matter where you were.
Okay.
So because the body had been discovered in a remote location near a major interstate, some investigators and then later commenters briefly considered whether Jane Doe 1 might be part of a broader group of highway-adjacent homicides that were being referred to at the time as the Great Basin Murders, which is
that sounds familiar,
relevant to this season.
Yeah.
So, and that possibility framed the case regionally rather than relationally. And importantly, it did not result in a confirmed linkage. And, like we've talked about, the Great Basin serial killer is actually a series of independent murders. But the Zyskowskis definitely fall into the Great Basin murders. And her case was considered one of the Great Basin homicides. So, but the association remained tentative and it was eventually set aside, like we've said. But what did persist instead was isolation. As far as Utah investigators knew in 1990, this was a single victim, killed in a remote location with no name and no clear connection to any other crime, and the passage of time did not change that assessment. For more than a decade, Jane Doe 1 remained exactly that, a homicide without identity, context, or resolution. only years later, evidence would emerge that finally connected this Utah case to another state, another victim, and another investigation entirely. But in October of 1990, none of that was visible. All that existed was a set of remains on a ridge in Millard County and a case that stood alone. Two places, hundreds of miles apart. In one, the land is flat and open, the highway stretching straight through ranch country, bordered by fences that disappear into the distance. In the other, the ground rises into ridges and canyons, the road cutting north and south through desert and stone. Different skies, different terrain, different jurisdictions, and yet the same silence. Case files sit on desks in separate states, each one complete in its own way and incomplete in every other. Names don't match, dates don't line up. There's no reason, on paper, for anyone to pick up the phone. In one place, a body has a name but no story. In the other, a body has a story but no name. Time passes, evidence is cataloged, files are closed and then reopened and then closed again. The road keeps carrying traffic through both places, day after day, indifferent to what's been left behind. Between those 2 points on the map, something important is missing. Not just information, but connection. And until that connection is made, these cases remain what they appear to be: separate tragedies, separated by distance, held apart by geography, awaiting in different states for answers that never seem to arrive. So the identification of Candy and Douglas did not happen all at once, obviously. It unfolded in stages across more than a decade. It was shaped by forensic tools, record-keeping systems, and interagency practices available at the end of the 20th century. So at the time their bodies were discovered, neither case benefited from the kind of national databases or automatic cross-state comparisons, nothing that exists today.
Right.
Instead, it depended on fragmented systems, manual reviews, and the preservation of evidence long enough for future comparison. And it's really kind of freaking nuts when you think about it. For the younger generation, this is just normal. But for those of us that are older and we lived through this, everything remained relatively the same for years and years and years and years. Like, there's not a shit ton of difference between what we were experiencing in the 80s and the 90s as to what happened in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s and the 40s as far as it goes with this kind of shit. We had fingerprints, we had dental records,
Yeah.
we had blood type.
Yeah.
Well, that was it. Now the shit has gone leaps and bounds from about this point, 1990, the early 90s when DNA started to come around, to now. It's like night and day different.
Yeah.
So,
and they can tell where you grew up by a piece of your tooth.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. By 1992, Douglas has been identified. And so his name has been restored, and it allowed investigators to notify his family and all of that kind of stuff. But his case remained incomplete. There was no known female counterpart, no identified suspect, and no awareness that his death might be connected to another homicide in another state.
Because why would you think that?
Right, exactly. And then you have Candy's remains, who were discovered in 1990 in Utah. And like we talked about, she was a Jane Doe. And the breakthrough in her case came in 2003 through a combination of persistence and interagency communication that didn't exist before. So Millard County Sheriff's Captain John Kimball consulted with a Texas Ranger regarding unsolved cases. And during that consultation, the ranger forwarded dental charts and records that were associated with Douglas Zyskowski's missing wife to the Utah authorities, and those records became the critical link. So forensic scientists and anthropologists, including experts affiliated with the University of Arizona, conducted a comparative dental analysis examining x-rays and preserved observations of the Utah victim's jaw and teeth alongside the dental charts that were provided from Texas. And the comparison showed concordant dental features, allowing investigators to formally identify Jane Doe 1 as Patricia Candace Walsh or Zyskowski. News coverage later emphasized that this identification occurred 13 years after her body was found, and that the otological comparison, not DNA alone, provided that decisive match. So Candy's remains were skeletal, eliminating any traditional identification methods. Fingerprints were not available. Visual identification was impossible. Teeth, however, endure. Dental structures and radiographs provided a durable, unique biological record that could bridge a 13-year gap between a missing person in Washington and a Jane Doe in rural Utah. So key steps in that process include preservation of the Utah victim's jaw and dentition, the transfer of Walsh's dental charts from Texas following the Kimball Ranger consultation, and the side-by-side comparison by forensic specialists evaluating tooth morphology, restorations, and anatomical landmarks. And so that process restored Candy's identity. And then DNA testing would later reinforce the case, and it was used to corroborate the linkage between Candy and Douglas and the offender that we'll find out is already incarcerated on another homicide. Importantly, DNA did not give Candy her name back. Dentals did. DNA served to confirm it, and it strengthened the case during the charging and the sentencing phases and tying both the victim's death to a single predator across state lines. So why the cases remained unsolved for so long really comes down to several factors that contributed to it. So it was, the lack of identification. And that part was intentional. They intentionally traveled without ID as part of their religious practice, leaving no wallets, no licenses, nothing at either scene. And then we have the decomposition in the environment. Both bodies were recovered after significant postmortem intervals. The geographic separation, one was in Texas, the other was in Utah. We have the era of the time. And then we have the clerical errors and the incompatible databases that prevented any kind of a match. And then we have competing investigative frameworks. Walsh's Utah case was at times viewed through a regional Great Basin lens rather than part of a missing couple. So what the timeline reflects is not indifference, but structural limitation. In 1990, there was no NamUs. There was no integrated national homicide linkage system. Rural sheriff's offices covered vast territories with limited personnel, and they relied on manual or at least semi-automated systems that required perfect data entry in order for them to function. So ultimately, it was evidence preservation that improved communication and time that allowed investigators to connect these two cases that geography had kept apart. So we've got this married couple. I mean, it's such a tragically sad story because, regardless of what you may think about their religious beliefs or whatever, at the end of the day, you have a very young couple who are doing what they feel is the right thing to do, which sets them apart so much from some other cases and stuff that we could talk about where you have people their age who are into drugs and running with the wrong crowd and partying it up at bars and getting into fights and doing all this kind of stuff. Here we have a young couple that are sharing their message of redemption to everybody that they can share it to. That's the difference between those two is so stark, and yet this young couple is found miles apart, both murdered, different states. I mean, it gets worse, obviously, as we go through this case, but yeah, it's it's a tough one to sit with for me because they were so young and just starting their lives. And, Douglas had a young son who then grew up without a dad,
Yeah.
And
well, if any of these become easy to sit with, we have a problem.
this is true, but it's exceptionally hard for me. And I think it is for you too. We've talked about it before, but the victims, like Candy, and thank God she was finally identified. Douglas was identified. It took a couple years, and I don't mean that a couple years is like no big deal, but compared to
13.
Candy, who was 13, but at least they were identified. At least somebody could go to their families and say, we found them.
Here they are.
Here they are, and you can lay them to rest. Some of the victims that we've talked about this season and some still to come, we still have nothing.
Yeah.
So when we started Rocky Mountain Reckoning, obviously we didn't start in 1990, and we didn't start looking at cases in 1990. We started in the early 70s with Star Valley Jane Doe, who was left behind in a world that still trusted distance more than systems, where highways expanded faster than law enforcement could follow, and where unidentified victims could vanish into the geography itself. That was the 1970s, a decade of movement without oversight, of anonymity without accountability, of freedom that outpaced the tools that were meant to protect it. As the series moved into the late 70s and 1980s, the landscape began to change, but not evenly. Interstates stretched farther, maybe. Long-haul trucking became routine. Travel became faster, cheaper, easier, but investigative infrastructure still lagged behind. The 1980s brought more awareness, more record-keeping, more technology, but it also brought fragmentation. States collected data differently. Counties operated in isolation. Computer systems existed, but they didn't always talk to each other. A single clerical error could still erase someone from the searchable world. And now in 1990, we arrive at a different moment. Not safer, just different. This was a time when people still believed the road belonged to everyone. Hitchhiking hadn't fully disappeared. Trust still moved more freely than fear. And for many, especially those that were guided by faith or by purpose, travel wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be embraced. And Candy and Douglas Zyskowski lived squarely in that moment. They weren't outliers from society. They weren't hiding on its edges. They were participating in it, moving openly, relying on strangers, believing the world was fundamentally navigable. And in many ways, it still was. But the danger didn't come from the margins. It came from scale. By 1990, the American West had become vast in a way earlier decades hadn't fully reckoned with. Distances between towns grew larger. Jurisdictions grew thinner. The highways that connected everything also created places where no one was really watching. A body found in rural Texas didn't automatically speak to a body found months later in rural Utah. A missing couple from Washington could fall between those spaces, not because no one cared, but because no single system could see the whole picture. That's the through line of this series, from Star Valley Jane Doe in the early 1970s, through the unresolved cases of the late 70s and 80s, and now into 1990. The world kept getting bigger, faster than our ability to track what was happening inside it. Each decade brought more freedom of movement. Each decade brought new blind spots. And each decade left victims behind who existed just outside the reach of connection. What we see in this case is not a failure of empathy. It's a failure of synchronization between states, between records, between people who never had reason to know that they were looking at pieces of the same story. Candy and Douglas didn't disappear because the world ignored them. They disappeared because they were moving through a system that wasn't built yet to follow them. That matters because when we talk about accountability later, and we will, it only means something if we understand the silence that came before it, the years where answers weren't withheld, they were just unreachable. This case doesn't stand alone. It sets in a long line of stories shaped by the same forces: open roads, limited oversight, and a county still learning how to connect what distance keeps apart. In the next episode, we'll move forward in this story into the moment when those connections finally begin to form, when technology, persistence, and circumstance all collide, and when a reckoning, delayed but unavoidable, finally arrives. But for now, we stay here in 1990 on open highways in a world that felt free and proved again that freedom always carries a cost.
Before we begin this victim tribute, we need to slow the pace for a moment like we do. Stories like this often pull us forward toward timelines, locations, and conclusions, but this space asks us to do something different. This isn't about advancing the investigation or revisiting what went wrong. It's about stepping back from the case long enough to remember the people whose lives existed before everything narrowed to a single moment. Patricia and Douglas Zyskowski were not defined by how their journey ended. They were a young, married couple moving through the world with intention, belief, and trust, building a life shaped by faith, purpose, and a shared sense of direction. Their story did not begin with violence, and it deserves to be remembered for more than its aftermath. As part of how we honor that, we're continuing our collaboration with the J.J. Hawk Band, whose music we use intentionally during select victim tributes. Their work, produced through Hawk Studios, isn't meant to explain the story or to heighten emotion. It exists to create space, to sit quietly alongside remembrance without intrusion. The song you're about to hear is called Point of No Return. It reflects the moment when a path changes irreversibly, when trust, movement, and possibility are cut short in ways that cannot be undone. As the music plays beneath the tribute, we ask you to listen gently, not for answers, not for conclusions, but for the lives that came before them and the future that should have been allowed to unfold. This is Point of No Return by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Patricia and Douglas Zyskowski.
Before Candy and Douglas Zyskowski became names attached to timelines, reports, and court filings, they were simply two people deciding how they wanted to exist in the world. They were young, they were newly married, and they believed their lives were meant to be lived outward, not carefully contained, not quietly protected, but shared. Candy was 23 years old, nearly 24, as she left Washington with her husband. Douglas was in his mid-20s. They were at a point in life where most people are still figuring out who they are and what they want to become. For them, that question had already been answered. They believed in purpose, they believed in calling, and they believed that faith was not something that you talked about from a distance. It was something you carried into the world and you practiced among others. Their journey was not about escape. It wasn't about restlessness or drifting or running from something unfinished. It was about commitment to each other, to their beliefs, and to a way of life that prioritized movement and connection over comfort and certainty. They didn't see the road as unpredictable or hostile. They saw it as shared space, a place where people cross paths for a reason. That belief shaped everything about how they traveled. They didn't move with suspicion. They didn't build their lives around worst-case scenarios. They trusted that human connection still mattered, that help would appear when it was needed, and that faith filled the gaps where planning ended. This wasn't an unusual worldview for the time that they lived in. In the late 80s and into the 90s, the world still felt navigable in ways that are hard to imagine now. You could cross state lines without leaving much trace. You could disappear into motion without intending to. You could rely on conversations and kindness rather than systems and safeguards. Candy and Douglas lived comfortably in that space. They trusted the world that they moved through, and they trusted each other inside it. Their marriage unfolded on the road, shaped not by permanence or property, but by shared experience. Their sense of success wasn't measured by accumulation or stability. It was measured by obedience to what they believed that they were called to do. And when we talk about them now, it's important to resist the pull of hindsight, the urge to retroactively rewrite their lives as cautionary tales. They were not reckless within the context that they lived in. They were not unaware of risk. They were simply operating in a world that still believed openness had value. That openness came with a cost, but it also came with meaning. Candy was not defined by the way that her life ended, and Douglas was not defined by where his body was found. They were defined by how they chose to live, in motion, in belief, and in partnership. When they disappeared, the loss did not stop with them. A family lost a daughter whose voice went silent without explanation. A family lost a son whose absence stretched across years and miles. And a child lost a father, not in a single moment, but gradually, through unanswered questions and long searches that led nowhere. Parents spent years traveling roads that never gave them back what they were looking for. They carried photographs, names, hope, and the constant uncertainty that comes with not knowing whether to search forward or to look back. For a long time, Candy and Douglas were separated not just by geography, but by recognition. One had a name without a complete story. The other had a story without a name. Their lives, lived together, were broken apart by distance, jurisdiction, and time. And yet, even in that separation, they were never truly apart. They were still husband and wife, still connected by the same journey, still bound to the same unanswered ending. Their story did not disappear because it lacked importance. It disappeared because the world they moved through was larger than the systems trying to follow it. The spaces between answers were wide, and silence could stretch without resistance. But silence does not erase meaning. In this episode, we've talked about highways and states and records and how a person could be lost not because no one cared, but because the world itself was too big to hold everything at once. This tribute is not about the failures of that world. It's about the people who live fully inside of it. Candy and Douglas believed life was meant to be engaged. That belief guided them across thousands of miles, into countless conversations, and through a shared purpose that mattered deeply to them. Their journey was interrupted, violently and permanently, but it was not undone. In the next episode, we'll return to this tribute. We will speak to remembrance, to accountability, and to what it means when truth arrives long after it could change the outcome. But this part of their story belongs here, before the reckoning, before the courtroom, before the name of the person responsible ever enters the narrative. Here, we remember Patricia, Candace, and Douglas Scott Zyskowski as they were. Two people who chose to live openly, who trusted deeply, and who believed their lives were meant to intersect with the world rather than hide from it. They were here, they were known, they were loved, and their story continues.
I'm not lost.
Before we close this episode, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the music you heard during the victim tribute. That music was provided by the J.J. Hawk Band, whose work allows us to create space for reflection without turning these stories into spectacle. Their contribution helps us slow the narrative down and remember that at the center of every case are real people, real lives, and real loss. We're grateful for their support of this series and the care that they bring to their work, and we're super excited about this collaboration.
So if you're finding value in Rocky Mountain Reckoning, there are several ways you can support what we do, starting with getting involved directly. The Dark Dialogue Collective is our volunteer boots on the ground program. It's not a donation tier. It's a way to help with research, record requests, transcription, mapping, and case support. Real work that helps keep these investigations moving forward. You can also learn about our adoptive victim program at darkdialogue.com, where we commit sustained energy and advocacy to individual cases. That same site hosts our victim blog posts, which are written to keep names and stories visible long after the headlines fade.
If you'd like to support the Dark Dialogue Network financially, we offer two options: Patreon for recurring support at patreon.com/darkdialoguepod, and Coffee for one-time support at coffee.com/darkdialogue. For long-form writing, case updates, and deeper analysis, you can subscribe to our Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com. And if you ever need to reach us directly, whether with information, questions, kudos, collaboration ideas, whatever it is, you can email us at info@darkdialogue.com.
You can also explore the other shows across the Dark Dialogue Network, including, and this is where John would take a really deep breath, Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Dark Dialogue Distilled, Dark Dialogue Unraveled Truths, Dark Dialogue Gallows and Gunfights, Dark Dialogue Shadow Chat Sessions. Each show approaches these stories from a different angle, but they all share the same commitment to accuracy, respect, and accountability.
And finally, if you're listening or watching on a platform that allows it, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a review. And if you're on YouTube, hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss future episodes. Those small actions make a real difference for independent shows like this one. Thank you for spending this time with us and for listening carefully. This has been Rocky Mountain Reckoning. Keep listening, keep advocating, take care of each other, and as always, make the guilty face the reckoning.